Now this morning, we explore how SMEs can unlock capital and grow their businesses with Jovas Asari, Managing Director of ARC Group International and a development finance specialist. He's an economist as well. But thank you so much for joining us, Jovas. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Very well, thank you for asking. First, let's start. Tell me a little bit about the ARC Group International first, and then we'll situate the conversation this morning.
Yeah, sure. So there's a problem in a lot of the settings we serve. We serve across 7 countries in Africa, and Ghana is one of our priority countries. And the common problem that we find is SMEs face a barrier to access the funding and investment they need to grow. So our model is to support them to have the know-how and overcome information gaps to be able to access the funding so they can focus on growing their businesses rather than spending so much time looking for funding and investment.
I see that. Do you find that a big task, or do you find it a very regular task?
So I think the problem's big. I think firstly, if we look at research where it says, the World Bank says there's around a 6.1 billion finance gap for SMEs in Ghana specifically, and it's much wider if we look at the wide, even just the region, it's much wider than that. So this is a common problem that many SMEs face. And in terms of the solution is not just centered on us. There's loads of different initiatives, but I think what is needed is, rather than organizations spending so much time looking for funding, what we need is more tools and infrastructure in the market that allow for these organizations to have a more simplified approach.
But Jovas, globally, there are many financial tools available, but I'm quite curious how Ghanaian SMEs or Ghanaian businesses still struggle to have access. What's the challenge? Why do they still struggle?
Yeah, so if we're talking about a wide range of businesses, so by SMEs, it's quite a wide spectrum. Specifically, for this conversation, I think it's important to frame sort of the SMEs we're talking about. So we have organizations, what forms what's called the missing middle. Essentially, those are organizations that are past that microfinance stage. They're not at an ideation stage, but they have potential to grow, but they're not yet at the large investment space either. So this is where you have a huge cluster of organizations that have high potential to grow, continue to create impact in their market, but they face barriers to be able to access the funding to grow as well. So these SMEs, yes, there's tools that are out there that they should be able to use, but I think what happens is, because they're facing such high barriers in terms of seeing what information there is to access grants, to know how to access these grants or investment, a lot of time gets spent on actually trying to look for grants and funding rather than positioning to use these tools to simplify, to be able to then focus on growing their businesses.
Is that what you describe as the missing middle? Is that what you describe as the missing middle? How would you break down the missing middle for somebody who hasn't started a business yet, right? And yet is would deal with those who have started already and facing the barrier of the missing middle. But how would you break it down for a new entry or a new entrant to understand what the missing middle really is?
Sure. So if you're an organization or a person that is planning to start a business, oftentimes the first step is actually starting that business, and you may need some capital to do that. Some organizations will bootstrap, there's microfinance and other things to see the support of growing that organization at the very early stage. What happens is, as you grow beyond that very early stage, you start to need to recruit more team members. You might need more resources to expand your supply, etc. And that's where usually there's a big gap, where you need more funding to be able to expand and grow further. And that's what the missing middle is. It's when you've passed the ideation stage, but you're not quite at the huge investment stage either. So if you're starting a business, I think the main thing to do is not just the access to the early funding or the access to the early resources. It's also about positioning, trying to think through how are you going to scale? How are you going to go beyond this missing middle? Not just start, but create a business that's going to last, be able to generate revenue, be able to, if needed, access funding, but navigate what is quite a complex and messy sort of access to finance space.
So primarily, what are we dealing with? Access or shortage? Or the both coexist?
Good question. We believe, and we advocate for this quite strongly. It's not that there's a lack of capital. There's definitely capital out there from different sources. Yes, with maybe slightly different agendas from those different sources. But the issue isn't a lack of capital nor a lack of resources. Part of the main problem is that there's a lack of being able to access those funding and capital, or have the know-how and the infrastructure to do so.
I like to think that a small business owner probably watching you this morning will say that, but I have been trying to assess and it's not working. What are some of those very simple mistakes that small business owners do, and which has now become that missing middle, which has now become the inaccessibility to the funding? What are some of the problems?
Yeah, sure. So let's focus on grants. So grants are a form of capital that would support you to essentially create some sort of impact, which you're already creating. A lot of organizations at that stage will be applying for grant funding, but oftentimes it's the approach that they struggle with. So we have 3 principles we use and advocate for. The first one is vision. That means that as an
The first one is what? Say that again.
Vision.
Okay, vision, right.
That means as an organization that is trying to access some sort of funding or even beyond grants, the starting point is vision. Make sure you know what your vision is. You're not changing your organization to meet the funder's vision, but you're solid in what you're trying to achieve. But at the same time, funders and investors have vision as well, trying to find that overlap and align with funders that are trying to achieve the same thing that you are, allows them to partner well with you. So vision is the first principle. Always make vision the center of what you're trying to do and find that overlap with funders that are trying to do the same thing but need a good local partner or a good contextual expert. And that brings to the second principle, which is partnership. Companies that are knocking on doors for funding, that's fine, but you need to approach it with the right mindset, where you are a contextual expert. You are the one that is solving a problem that's close to the context that you're serving. So that makes you an ideal partner for funders or investors that are trying to achieve a similar vision, but need a vehicle, i.e. a business that they can trust to be able to channel those funds through to create that impact. So when applying for grants or funding, it's not in the position of we need this money, please help us find funds or money. Instead of saying that actually this is the problem we're solving, this is how we're doing it, this is the context, and we are the experts in solving this problem and the ideal partners to make that funding grow. And then the third principle is sustainability. Any funds, especially grant funds that you're accessing, you need to be able to have some sort of way to allow for it to cause your organization to be financially resilient. So you don't want to be accessing funds and then accessing more funds and then more funds. Imagine it's on a journey, these funders and investors are on a journey with you. And you need to make sure that the funds are going to be multiplied in your organization so that you're not positioning to need more funding after, but instead you're positioning to allow for the funding you've used, create more revenue streams for your organization.
Okay, so Jarvis, you have put this into 3 categories: the vision, partnership, and sustainability. For a business owner watching me this morning will say, well, yesterday I had this vision, today I want to alter it a bit, I want to do something about it. This will mean that the access to funding as well will alter, which will mean that whoever is going to be partnering with you would also have to change. Is that what you mean?
No, I think that what you have to see is that your vision would develop and grow over time in terms of how you're achieving it. For example, you might have a vision to improve the livelihoods of the smallholder farmers in your community. That would remain constant. How we deliver that would probably evolve over time. What you're looking for in funding is if there's funders that align with this. So there might be funders that say, okay, we're supporting livelihood development, or we're supporting agricultural development or food security. All of those have some alignment with that vision. It's not that a funder would have a complete overlap in the exact same vision, but the vision might be able to be segmented and you find where the overlap is, and that's where there's an opportunity. So you're not shifting and changing your vision for the funder. Your vision's evolving, and as you're evolving, you need to be able to keep on top of what different funders' visions and priorities are as well. And that's where there's opportunity to have funding partnerships.
Okay, so these 3 thematic areas that you have just introduced business owners to would be some of the problems they probably overlook, and which is why they're not getting funding. Let's now focus on the funders or the investors. What are they also looking out for? Do they concern themselves with these 3 thematic areas? Do they have entirely different areas they look out for?
So funders are looking for some of the basics, such as your company should be legally registered. You should have some sort of ambition to grow beyond that funding, some sort of product or service that's solving a problem that you're trying to, that they're also trying to solve. And those are some of the basics. Each funder would be different in terms of their priorities and their thematic area. But in terms of what you want to do is make sure you have some of the fundamentals in place, such as registration, such as teams in place, etc. But it's important to emphasize, yes, the funder is looking for that, but you're not doing that because of the funder. Those are general things you'd want to have in place for growing any business, regardless if it is for aiming for funding or aiming for investment. And all of this is about risk, how the funders and the investors would see your organization in terms of their risk. If I'm an investor and I want to invest in an organization that is not registered yet, that raises red flags to me. So generally, it's important to have these fundamentals in place. But yes, funders and investors would be looking at also these same growth principles.
Well, Jevis, you know, especially because you're set up in Ghana. Over here in Ghana, the most practical way for small business owners will be the traditional way, bank loans. That's one of the most quickest any business owner will think of. I like to expand my business. I need some investments. The first point they would think about would be the bank loans. But hearing from you now, you had mentioned a thing called grants, which would mean that there are different types of investments. You want to introduce our viewers to that?
Yeah, sure. So grants are not loans. Grants are essentially, and they're not free money either. Some people think a grant is free money. No, it's not. I think it's important to understand that different funders and investors will be looking at returns regardless. A loan would look at financial returns. So the provider of that loan wants to grow their income. A grant would look at impact returns. So you might be saying, I'm going to expand my work to improve livelihoods of farmers in my community. That is the impact they would want to see as they invest that grant in you. So yes, you don't need to pay them back financially, but you need to report to them that that impact is being achieved.
Okay, that's one of the modules. Is there any other list? There's grants. In my little readings as well, I came across challenge funds, accelerators, angel investors, impact investments, blended finance, diaspora investments. That's a lot. It's just would be because of my reading I came across this. Would you want to walk us through some of these ones as well? And which ones small business owners or SMEs should focus on largely? Yeah,
sure. So let me talk a little bit about blended finance, which sounds like a fancy term for something that's a lot more simple than it should be. So with blended finance, essentially you're saying, as we discussed before, the different visions and different agendas for funders and investors. As a business, when you're looking at what type of funding and investment might fund your business, it's important to be able to take a step back and strategize as well. So blended finance essentially says that with these different funders and investors with different agendas, they can come together to work for a common vehicle, your business. We bucket them into two categories. So concessional funders, these are things like grant funders that are looking at impact. And then you also have private investment, which is looking at financial returns. So I'll give an example. If I'm a business, we'll use the same improving the livelihoods of farmers that's around me, and I want to aggregate their harvest and bring it to market, and I've got a platform that I'm developing to do so. I can go to a grant funder and get the grant funder to support some of the development of that platform, and in return, I'm reporting on the impacts that's being done. That improves the conversation I have when I go to an investor, because that investor now sees me as less risky. So that investor is able to say, okay, my perceived risk is now decreased. I'm now more confident that this business is making progress because there's a funder that's already backing them, but also that capital costs, the high costs that would have been I would have had to incur as an investor to develop the platform further is being covered by this grant funder. So I can now get involved and be able to invest in this company. So it's not necessarily about the actual vehicles. To some extent it is, it depends on your business, but it's more about the strategy that underlies it. So in all of these different options, try to see what is the journey you're on and how you can pull the funders and investors in at different spaces. The two that we work on is grants. So accessing grants at that growth stage, which helps to de-risk, and then that positions an organization to leverage investment. The investment that we work on leveraging is diaspora investment. So essentially we're saying with diaspora, there's a slightly adjusts risk perceptions, or at least if it's channeled correctly, there may be good partners that bridge investment beyond the grant funding. So this is not to say those are the two categories that fit everyone, but it's to say, as you look for funding and investment, your objective is not just to knock on doors and anyone that gives money is suitable. Instead, it's to strategically see what is going to help position your organization for further growth along that journey. Well,
Jova, so that's for somebody who is looking. Let's get some free consultation, because you have done the research, you know the numbers, and you know the sectors, particularly in Ghana, that are ready for that potential funding or investments. The sectors in Ghana currently. Somebody's got their pen and paper, they're probably ready. They probably have never even thought about it, that this sector, if I went into it, there's some sort of funding or investment ready that I can harness. You want to walk us through some of these opportunities?
Yeah, sure. But I think one caveat before that is it's the setting up the venture and the business, I think, should be based on solving a problem, not just where the funding is. In terms of where the funding goes, it varies. There's no shortage of funds. It's often about being able to see where the funds are. But if we're looking at the impact side of things, those funders, which can be family offices, it could be even the UK government fund stuff in Ghana, development partners, etc. They usually talk about impact in the form of sustainable development goals. So what that means is, if you're starting a venture in something that decreases poverty or something that strengthens the reliability of energy access, those are all things that's already in the sustainable development goals. And it's very likely there's funding that would help to support the growth of the organization. So rather than a specific sector, I say the SDGs are usually a good starting point, not to start a venture just based on those, but you're already probably have some sort of problem that you're solving along one of those SDGs, and that's a starting point.
Okay. Well, I can have this conversation, Jovas, with you for a long while, but I may have to end the conversation. But a final question for you before I wrap would be that you have the attention of policymakers. They're watching us right now. If you have a second to just, recommend what we can do to improve SME financing in this country, what would that recommendation be?
I'll say that we need to look beyond the traditional boxes. In Ghana, we've done a report on this, which actually includes a fair amount of government and policy makers and development partners on diaspora investment. Diaspora investment is one thing that has been taking place in Ghana for a long time, but there isn't the infrastructure in place to ensure that there's good partnerships that allow for the capital to flow and have good partnerships in the private sector. So that's just one example. I'll say from a policy standpoint, yes, there's a lot has been done in Ghana on diaspora investment, but we also need to move from just the policy to also implementation of infrastructure and supporting existing infrastructure, which Ghana does have some up and coming ones, so that we can make tangible differences. And again, the SMEs have tools they can use that they can use along their journey.
Well, Jevers, I look forward to picking up this conversation again with you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this morning.
Thank you.
Jevers Asari is Managing Director of ACK Group International, and he is a development finance specialist. Please stay away, nearly wrapping the show, but one more conversation before that.